Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. If I handed you unlimited money for just one day, would your first purchase reveal your dreams or your character? The question appeared on the giant screen just as the crystal chandeliers dimmed inside the Grand Aurora Ballroom in Manhattan. Every conversation faded into silence. Hundreds of invited guests turned toward the stage where Caleb Whitmore stood alone beneath a single spotlight. At 38, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Global Holdings had built one of America's fastest-growing investment empires. Yet the calm expression on his face carried none of the excitement the audience expected. Instead, there was quiet disappointment hidden behind his confident smile, the kind that came from learning too many expensive lessons about people. Reporters often called him America's most eligible billionaire, but none of them knew why he had stopped believing compliments years ago. Too many people admired the size of his fortune before asking about the person who earned it. Too many relationships had begun with admiration and ended with invoices disguised as affection. Tonight was different. Tonight, Caleb wasn't searching for the smartest woman in the room, the most beautiful face, or the perfect social media image. He was searching for something money had never been able to buy: authenticity. Four women sat at a polished table near the front of the ballroom, each invited after passing weeks of interviews that none of them fully understood. They had been told only that one final challenge remained before a life-changing opportunity would be offered. The first woman adjusted the diamond earrings she had borrowed for the evening, already imagining luxury boutiques waiting for her tomorrow. The second kept checking her reflection in her phone, convinced confidence alone could win any competition. The third smiled every time a camera pointed in her direction, carefully posing even while pretending not to notice. The fourth woman barely looked up from her folded hands. Mara Ellison sat quietly in a simple navy dress she had purchased years earlier for a cousin's wedding. It fit well enough, though the sleeves had faded slightly after countless washes. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. In fact, she looked as though she wished the spotlight would never find her. Her light brown hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and every few seconds she tucked a loose strand behind her ear before lowering her eyes again. She worked at a small independent bookstore in Brooklyn, where the loudest sound most afternoons was the turning of pages. Crowds made her nervous. Attention made her uncomfortable. She still couldn't understand why someone like Caleb Whitmore had invited someone like her. Caleb stepped forward carrying a black velvet case. Without saying another word, he opened it. Inside rested 4 identical matte black credit cards. No visible numbers. No logos except a discreet silver W engraved in the corner. Gasps rippled across the room. Caleb lifted one card between his fingers. "Each of you will receive one of these cards," he said evenly. "There is no preset spending limit. For the next 24 hours, buy whatever you believe tells me who you truly are." The ballroom erupted into whispers. Unlimited spending. 24 hours. Cameras flashed like fireworks. The first 3 women exchanged stunned smiles, already whispering about designer stores along Fifth Avenue. Mara remained perfectly still. She stared at the card as though it weighed far more than metal and plastic ever should. Caleb walked toward the table himself instead of asking an assistant. One by one, he placed a card before each woman. When he reached Mara, she hesitated before touching it. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge but didn't pick it up immediately. Finally, she looked into Caleb's eyes with genuine uncertainty instead of excitement. "May I ask one question?" she said softly. The ballroom grew unexpectedly quiet. Caleb nodded. "Of course." Mara swallowed before speaking. Is there a limit?" A few people laughed under their breath. One woman at the table rolled her eyes as though the question itself proved Mara didn't belong there. Caleb never smiled. He held Mara's gaze for another moment before answering with calm sincerity. "Only your conscience." Mara looked back down at the black card resting in front of her. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply slipped it carefully into her small handbag as though she had just accepted a responsibility instead of a reward. Caleb noticed something no one else did. The other 3 women looked at the card and imagined everything they could finally own. Mara looked at the card and seemed to wonder what it might cost her to use it. The ballroom slowly emptied. But the question Caleb had asked continued echoing through every conversation long after the applause faded. Outside, sleek black town cars lined the curb while photographers shouted names, hoping to capture the four women beginning what many already called the opportunity of a lifetime. The first woman climbed into her car laughing excitedly as she searched for the nearest luxury boutique that would still be open. The second immediately called her closest friends, promising a shopping spree none of them would ever forget. The third posted a carefully edited photo of the matte black card online with a caption about destiny, finally rewarding hard work. Within minutes, hundreds of strangers were celebrating her apparent success. Mara quietly walked past the cameras without saying a word. She pulled her coat tighter against the cool Manhattan evening and headed toward the subway entrance instead of the waiting luxury transportation that had been offered to every participant. She preferred trains. They gave her time to think. As the downtown train rumbled beneath the city, she opened her handbag and looked at the black card resting inside. It seemed strangely out of place beside her worn library card, a folded grocery list, and a faded photograph of her mother smiling in front of their tiny house years earlier. Unlimited money. 24 hours. She should have felt excited. Instead, she felt nervous. Her thoughts wandered back to the bookstore where she spent most afternoons recommending novels to strangers who often stayed longer to talk than to buy anything. Her manager always joked that Mara could remember every customer's favorite author, but forgot to buy herself a new winter coat. She smiled faintly at the memory before slipping the card back into her bag. Across town, Caleb entered the private control room inside Whitmore Global Headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling monitors illuminated the otherwise dark space. His chief of staff, Evelyn Ross, already stood beside a long table covered with encrypted tablets displaying live transaction reports connected to the four cards. She had worked beside Caleb for nearly 12 years and understood that this experiment had little to do with money. "Do you really believe one day is enough to understand someone?" she asked quietly. Caleb loosened his tie before answering. "No, but the first decision people make when nobody tells them what to do usually says more than 100 interviews ever could." Evelyn nodded, although she remained skeptical. "The media will assume you are looking for a business partner." Caleb looked toward one of the monitors. "Let them." Early the next morning, before the city fully awakened, alerts began appearing across the screens. Card 1. Purchase approved. $38,000 at an exclusive designer boutique on Fifth Avenue. Card 2. Purchase approved. $26,000 at a luxury jewelry salon. Minutes later came reservations for an oceanfront resort, premium spa treatments, and several high-end fashion retailers. Evelyn glanced toward Caleb without speaking. His expression remained unreadable as each notification appeared. Nothing surprised him anymore. Then another alert flashed. Card 3. Purchase approved. $14,000 at an upscale watch gallery, followed almost immediately by payments to a celebrity stylist and a luxury photography studio. Social media posts featuring expensive shopping bags began spreading online less than an hour later. Caleb slowly exhaled. "Exactly what I expected," he murmured. Evelyn reached for her coffee. "And card 4. Caleb looked toward the final column on the display. Still empty. No purchases. No reservations. No activity at all. Nearly 3 hours passed before the first notification finally appeared. It was not from a department store. It was not from a jewelry boutique. It was not even from Manhattan. The transaction came from a modest neighborhood pharmacy in Brooklyn. $48.63. Evelyn frowned. Medicine. Before either of them could guess further, another notification appeared. A neighborhood grocery store. $112.14. Then another. A small children's shoe store. Then a local bakery. Then a community food pantry accepting digital donations. Caleb leaned closer to the screen, saying nothing as the list quietly grew. Every purchase was practical. Every location ordinary. Every amount surprisingly modest. There was still no sign that Mara had bought a single thing for herself. And for the first time since the challenge began, Caleb found himself far more interested in the quiet woman who had asked about limits than in everyone else who had been searching for luxury. Mara left the grocery store carrying 2 reusable bags instead of glossy shopping bags decorated with luxury logos. She walked 3 blocks through a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood until she reached a modest brick apartment building where an elderly woman struggled to unlock her front door while balancing a walker and a small oxygen tank. "Let me help you, Mrs. Donnelly," Mara said with her usual gentle smile. The older woman looked relieved. "You always seem to arrive at exactly the right moment." Mara carried the groceries upstairs, carefully placing fresh fruit, soup, bread, milk, and medication on the kitchen counter. Mrs. Donnelly reached into her purse, trying to count several wrinkled dollar bills. Mara softly pushed her hand away. "Please keep it. You need your prescription refill next week." The elderly woman looked at her with watery eyes. "You are too kind for this world." Mara simply smiled. "Someone was kind to my mother once. I am only passing it forward." A few minutes later, she quietly left before the grateful woman could thank her again. Her next stop was a neighborhood elementary school where the guidance counselor greeted her with surprise. "Mara, what brings you here during work hours?" Mara placed several colorful bags on the office desk. Inside were brand new shoes, backpacks, notebooks, winter gloves, and children's novels. "Some families requested assistance for the new semester," Mara explained. "Please tell them these came from someone who believes in fresh starts." The counselor looked at the supplies in disbelief. This must have cost a fortune. Mara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Maybe, but they are worth much more once they belong to children who need them." She politely declined having her name placed on any donation list before quietly walking back outside. Across the city, another notification appeared on the monitors inside Whitmore Global Headquarters. Caleb studied every transaction without interrupting the silence. Pharmacy, groceries, children's supplies, local businesses instead of famous brands, community needs instead of personal luxury. None of it fit the pattern he had expected. Evelyn folded her arms. She is either extraordinarily generous or extraordinarily clever. Caleb continued reading the reports. If this is an act, it is the most expensive performance anyone has ever staged. Another alert appeared. Donation to a neighborhood literacy program. Then purchases from a local print shop. Then several invoices from a small independent bookstore. Caleb raised an eyebrow. She bought books. Evelyn enlarged the receipt on the screen. Not exactly. She prepaid reading vouchers for children whose families cannot afford books. Caleb leaned back slowly. For years, he had reviewed billion-dollar investment proposals in less time than he was now spending studying $40 receipts. Something about Mara's decisions refused to leave his thoughts. By early afternoon, curiosity replaced skepticism. "Prepare the car," he finally said. Evelyn looked up from her tablet. "You are going yourself?" Caleb nodded once. "Numbers explain what people do. I want to understand why." Less than an hour later, a dark gray sedan stopped quietly across the street from a small independent bookstore with weathered blue trim and flower boxes beneath the windows. There were no cameras, no security details surrounding the entrance, and no signs that one of the richest men in America had just arrived. Caleb wore dark jeans, a simple jacket, and a baseball cap that concealed most of his face. Through the front window, he immediately spotted Mara arranging books on a wooden display table. She greeted every customer with the same warm smile regardless of whether they purchased anything. A little boy held up a dinosaur book before sadly placing it back on the shelf after whispering to his father. Without saying a word, Mara walked over, scanned a small voucher from behind the register, and handed the book back to the child. "Someone already paid for this adventure," she said. "It looks like today is your lucky day." The boy's eyes grew wide with excitement as he hugged the book against his chest. His father repeatedly tried to ask who had paid, but Mara only smiled and wished them a wonderful afternoon. Standing quietly outside the window, Caleb watched the child skip down the sidewalk, holding the book as though it were treasure. He reached for the car door, tempted to introduce himself, but stopped. If she discovered who he really was, every moment afterward might become impossible to trust. For now, the truth had to remain hidden. For reasons he could not explain, that simple moment stayed with him far longer than any luxury purchase ever could. Mara finished her afternoon shift just as the bookstore owner locked the front door and thanked her for another busy day. She smiled politely, adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, and continued walking instead of heading home. Caleb remained several steps behind on the opposite side of the street, careful not to draw attention. He told himself he was simply verifying whether her kindness was genuine, but with every passing block, that explanation became harder to believe. Mara stopped outside a small neighborhood bakery where the owner greeted her by name before handing over several neatly packed boxes. She paid using the same black card, accepted the receipt without looking at the total, and thanked the baker as though she were the one receiving the favor. Caleb expected her to continue home. Instead, she carried the boxes another 6 blocks until she reached a modest women's shelter tucked between 2 aging brick buildings. There was no grand entrance, no television cameras, and no donors posing for photographs. A handmade welcome sign hung beside the door, decorated with colorful paper flowers clearly crafted by children during an art activity. Mara knocked softly before stepping inside. Curious, Caleb remained across the street where he could quietly observe through the front windows. A few minutes later, he saw volunteers arranging tables while several women shared coffee and quiet conversations. Mara opened the bakery boxes, revealing fresh bread, muffins, and fruit pastries. The smiles that immediately spread across the room carried a warmth that expensive restaurants rarely possessed. She laughed gently with everyone around her, never mentioning where the food had come from or how it had been purchased. One elderly volunteer hugged her before pointing toward a young mother sitting alone near the corner. Mara walked over carrying 2 plates and took the empty chair beside her. Caleb expected to see another generous donation. Instead, he noticed she never opened her wallet again. She gave something far rarer than money. She gave her full attention. They spoke for several minutes. Although Caleb could not hear the conversation through the glass, he noticed something remarkable. Mara listened far more than she talked. She nodded, offered reassuring smiles, and occasionally reached across the table to gently squeeze the woman's hand with quiet encouragement. There was no performance in her kindness, no audience, no expectation of recognition. After nearly an hour, Mara quietly left through the back entrance carrying several empty boxes. Caleb crossed the street only after she disappeared around the corner. The elderly volunteer who had greeted Mara earlier was locking the front door when he politely approached. "Excuse me," he said. "I hope I am not interrupting. I noticed the young woman who was just here." The volunteer smiled immediately. "Mara," Caleb nodded. "Does she come here often?" The woman's expression softened. "Almost every week. Sometimes with food. Sometimes with books. Sometimes she simply listens to people who feel invisible. She always says that hope arrives in different packages." Caleb glanced toward the building. "Does she work with your organization?" The volunteer quietly shook her head. "No, she has never accepted a title. She says kindness should not require a business card." Caleb remained silent. "Did someone sponsor today's donations?" he finally asked. The volunteer looked surprised by the question. "No, she insisted on paying herself, although I know she cannot really afford it. We have tried to convince her to keep more for herself, but she always smiles and says she already has enough." Caleb thanked the volunteer before slowly walking back toward his waiting car. Inside, Evelyn looked up from her tablet. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Caleb stared through the windshield for several long seconds before answering. "No." Evelyn frowned slightly. "Then what did you find?" Caleb watched Mara disappear into the evening crowd, carrying nothing except her old canvas bag. Someone who had every opportunity to change her own life first, and somehow decided everyone else came before her. Just as he was about to leave, another transaction alert appeared on Evelyn's phone. This purchase was unlike any of the others. It came from a neighborhood hospital. Caleb immediately turned back toward the car. "Find out where she is going." Mara arrived at the neighborhood hospital just before sunset, carrying nothing more than her canvas bag and a paper sack from the pharmacy. She greeted the receptionist by name before quietly signing the visitor log, something she had apparently done many times before. Caleb remained inside his parked sedan across the street, watching through the glass entrance as she disappeared down a hallway lined with faded family photographs donated by former patients. He had expected another charitable errand. What he did not expect was how familiar everyone inside the building seemed to be with her. Nurses smiled as she passed. A maintenance worker waved cheerfully from the end of the corridor. Even the security guard tipped his cap with genuine affection. Evelyn, sitting beside Caleb, noticed the same thing. "She is not acting like a visitor," she observed softly. "She is acting like someone who belongs here." Caleb nodded without taking his eyes off the entrance. Let us find out why. Several minutes later, he quietly entered the hospital wearing the same simple clothes that concealed his public identity. This time he was no longer following the transactions. He was following the woman behind them. He asked a volunteer where he might find Mara Ellison. The elderly volunteer smiled immediately. Room 312. She never misses Thursdays. Caleb thanked her and slowly walked toward the room, stopping before the partially opened door. Inside, Mara sat beside an older woman resting comfortably in bed. She gently peeled an orange, placed the slices onto a small plate, and opened a novel that looked well-loved from years of careful reading. "Would you like to continue where we stopped last week?" Mara asked. The woman smiled warmly. "Only if you promise to read the funny voices again." Mara laughed quietly. "I cannot promise they will be any better." She began reading with warmth and patience, changing her voice for each character until the woman laughed so hard that tears formed in the corners of her eyes. Caleb stood motionless outside the room. There was no audience, no cameras, no publicity, just one person giving another the priceless gift of time. After the chapter ended, Mara quietly confirmed the prescriptions had already been covered through the patient assistance desk. "These should cover another month," she whispered. "Please do not tell her who paid. She would worry." The nurse nodded gratefully. "You always do this." Mara simply smiled. Everyone deserves one less thing to worry about. Caleb quietly stepped away before she could notice him. His thoughts drifted to his own childhood, when his widowed mother had spent months recovering in a community hospital after a serious illness. He remembered strangers leaving flowers outside her room, volunteers reading to patients who had no family nearby, and anonymous donors paying bills without ever revealing their names. His mother used to tell him that invisible kindness was the purest form because it expected nothing in return. Somewhere along the road to becoming a billionaire, he had forgotten those words. As they returned to the car, Evelyn glanced at him carefully. "You have been unusually quiet." Caleb looked out the window as nurses hurried through the parking lot changing shifts. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. "She never spends the money to make herself look generous. She spends it where almost nobody will ever know." Before Evelyn could answer, another notification appeared on her tablet. Mara had used the black card one final time that evening. The purchase was from a small print shop less than 2 miles away. Curious, Caleb asked the driver to continue. When they arrived, the owner was locking the front door with several flat cardboard boxes stacked beside him. Caleb politely introduced himself only as a customer. "May I ask what those are?" The owner smiled proudly. 500 bookmarks. A young woman ordered them this afternoon. He opened one box and handed Caleb a sample. The bookmark was beautifully designed with watercolor illustrations of trees and books. At the bottom, a simple sentence appeared in elegant lettering. "Every story deserves someone who believes it can have a better ending." There was no company logo, no donor recognition, no signature. Caleb turned the bookmark over several times before carefully placing it back inside the box. He suddenly realized that while the other 3 participants had spent the day trying to become more impressive, Mara had quietly spent hers helping complete strangers believe tomorrow could be better than today. Back inside the car, Caleb quietly made a decision he had not planned when this experiment began. Tomorrow's gala would no longer be just an announcement. It would change both of their lives forever. The following morning, the final 24-hour window quietly came to an end. Across Manhattan, the 3 remaining participants woke to deliveries of designer handbags, luxury watches, custom jewelry, and garment bags carrying evening gowns that cost more than most families earned in a month. Their social media pages overflowed with carefully staged photographs celebrating a lifestyle they hoped would soon become permanent. Meanwhile, Mara woke before sunrise inside her modest apartment. She brewed a simple cup of coffee, watered the small herbs growing beside her kitchen window, and carefully balanced the household budget in a worn notebook that she had kept for years. The black card rested quietly on the table beside her. She stared at it for several long moments before placing it back inside the velvet envelope exactly as she had received it. As far as she was concerned, its purpose had already been fulfilled. Several hours later, Caleb sat alone inside the executive conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Spread across the polished walnut table were detailed reports showing every purchase made with each of the 4 cards. One report contained pages filled with luxury retailers, exclusive memberships, personal stylists, and expensive reservations. Another reflected nearly identical choices with different brand names. The third looked no different. The fourth report, however, barely resembled a spending record at all. Pharmacies, grocery stores, children's books, school supplies, hospital prescriptions, shelter donations, fresh bakery deliveries, reading vouchers, community programs. Every dollar had quietly flowed towards someone else's need. Caleb slowly closed the folder and remained silent. Evelyn finally broke the quiet. You already know who passed your test. Caleb looked out across the city before answering. She was never taking my test. Evelyn tilted her head. What do you mean? He smiled faintly for the first time in days. She was simply living the way she always lives. The card changed everyone else's behavior. It never changed hers. Before either of them could continue, Caleb's assistant entered with a small sealed envelope that had just arrived by courier. This was delivered from Miss Ellison. Caleb thanked him and carefully opened it. Inside rested the black credit card, polished and untouched since its final purchase, along with a short handwritten note in neat blue ink. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for trusting me with something so valuable. I have returned the remaining privilege because it belongs to you, but I hope the kindness it allowed will continue belonging to the people who needed it most. Thank you for reminding me that generosity sometimes arrives through unexpected hands. Respectfully, Mara Ellison. The room fell completely silent. Caleb read the letter again, then a third time. Finally, he turned the card over in his hand before quietly placing both items back inside the envelope with unusual care. Evelyn watched his expression soften. She returned it without anyone asking. Caleb nodded. Most people would have searched for one last purchase before midnight. He looked toward the handwritten note once more. She searched for the right moment to give it back. That afternoon, invitations were sent to all 4 participants requesting their presence at Whitmore Global's annual philanthropy gala the following evening, where Caleb promised to announce the final outcome of the challenge before business leaders, journalists, nonprofit directors, and community partners from across New York City. News of the announcement spread rapidly. The 3 women who had proudly displayed their purchases confidently assumed the celebration would recognize style, confidence, and ambition. None of them imagined that every transaction had quietly revealed far more than receipts. Across Brooklyn, Mara opened the invitation while shelving novels inside the bookstore. She immediately felt a knot form in her stomach. She remembered every dollar she had spent helping strangers, yet she worried she had misunderstood the challenge completely. Perhaps Caleb had wanted proof that someone could handle extraordinary wealth responsibly by investing it wisely instead of giving it away. Perhaps she had failed before ever realizing there were rules she had never been told. As closing time approached, her manager noticed the concern on her face. Everything all right? Mara forced a small smile. I'm not sure. Tomorrow I find out whether kindness was the right answer, or simply the wrong answer to the wrong question. The Whitmore Global Philanthropy Gala transformed the Grand Aurora Ballroom into a sea of elegant black tuxedos, shimmering evening gowns, and soft golden light reflecting across polished marble floors. Business executives, nonprofit leaders, journalists, and invited guests filled every table, all eager to discover which of the 4 women had impressed Caleb Whitmore enough to earn his mysterious final opportunity. Near the center of the room, the 3 confident participants greeted one another with bright smiles, comparing stories about exclusive boutiques and luxury experiences they had enjoyed over the previous 2 days. They spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, laughing as they admired each other's designer accessories purchased with the black cards. Mara quietly entered several minutes later wearing the same simple navy dress she had worn at the first event. She had carefully pressed it that morning, hoping it still looked presentable. Almost immediately, one of the women noticed her and exchanged an amused glance with the others. You wore the same dress again? She asked with a playful laugh that carried farther than she intended. Another smiled politely before adding, I suppose when someone spends all the money on strangers, there is not much left for herself. A few nearby guests chuckled awkwardly. Mara lowered her eyes but remained calm. I did not think tonight was about clothing, she answered gently. Maybe not, the third woman replied with a confident smile. But first impressions still matter. Before Mara could respond, a waiter approached carrying sparkling water. She thanked him warmly and stepped aside, hoping to avoid further attention. Across the ballroom, Caleb had witnessed the exchange without saying a word. Standing beside Evelyn near the stage entrance, he watched not only the conversation but the reactions surrounding it. Mara never defended herself. She never criticized anyone. She simply chose peace over pride. That quiet decision told him even more than every transaction report combined. Moments later, the ballroom lights dimmed as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to the evening. After recognizing several charitable organizations supported by Whitmore Global, he invited Caleb onto the stage. Warm applause echoed throughout the room as Caleb approached the podium carrying 4 identical folders. He thanked the audience for supporting community initiatives before turning his attention toward the 4 women seated together near the front. Several days ago, he began, I presented each participant with the exact same opportunity, the same amount of trust, the same amount of freedom. I never asked anyone to buy expensive things. I never asked anyone to donate money. I simply asked each person to reveal who they truly were. Silence settled across the ballroom. Large projection screens behind him displayed 4 timelines labeled only Card 1, Card 2, Card 3, and Card 4. Caleb continued. Every purchase told a story. Luxury clothing, jewelry, exclusive experiences. There is nothing inherently wrong with enjoying beautiful things. But my challenge was never about wealth. It was about priorities. The first 3 women shifted uneasily as photographs of receipts appeared beside designer store logos. No names were shown, but everyone in the room understood what they represented. Caleb then pressed a small remote. The 4th timeline filled the screen. Instead of luxury brands, photographs appeared of neighborhood bookstores, community food programs, children's backpacks, hospital prescriptions, bakery boxes, literacy vouchers, and handwritten thank you notes from local organizations. A quiet murmur spread throughout the audience. One participant, Caleb said softly, used extraordinary resources to accomplish ordinary miracles. She never purchased recognition. She purchased relief for people carrying burdens she could quietly lighten. Mara looked toward the stage in complete surprise. She had never expected anyone to know where the money had gone. Caleb slowly stepped away from the podium and walked toward the front row. Every camera followed him. He stopped directly beside Mara and offered his hand. Miss Ellison, he said warmly, would you please join me on stage? The ballroom became completely silent as Mara looked around uncertainly before slowly accepting his hand. She walked beside him beneath hundreds of curious eyes, unaware that the greatest revelation of the evening had only just begun. Standing beneath the bright stage lights, Mara felt as though the entire ballroom had disappeared, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat. She looked at Caleb with quiet confusion, convinced there had been some misunderstanding. Mr. Whitmore, she whispered, careful not to interrupt the event. I think you have given me far too much credit. Caleb smiled gently before turning back toward the audience. Actually, Miss Ellison, I have not given you enough. A faint wave of curiosity swept across the room. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the same handwritten note Mara had mailed back with the black card. He held it up for everyone to see before reading a single sentence aloud. Thank you for trusting me with something so valuable. I hope the kindness it allowed will continue belonging to the people who needed it most. He lowered the letter and looked directly at the audience. This note arrived with the card returned. No reminder, no deadline, no request. She simply believed it was the right thing to do. The ballroom remained silent. Caleb pressed another button on the presentation remote. New images appeared across the giant screens. They were not surveillance photographs, but letters of gratitude voluntarily provided by local organizations after being contacted by Whitmore Global during the verification process. One showed the elementary school that had received backpacks and books. Another came from the neighborhood hospital thanking an anonymous donor for covering prescription costs. Another displayed smiling volunteers arranging bread inside the women's shelter. The final image showed children proudly holding brand new books inside the small Brooklyn bookstore. Every organization was asked the same question. Caleb continued. Did the donor request publicity? Every answer was identical. No. In fact, several organizations told us she specifically asked that her name never be mentioned. Mara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment rather than pride. She quietly shook her head. Please, she whispered. They did not need to do this. Caleb heard her and answered softly enough that only the front rows could catch his words. Perhaps, but people deserve to know what genuine generosity looks like. He then turned back toward the audience. Many people assume wealth changes character. In my experience, wealth simply magnifies what is already there. Give someone unlimited resources for one day, and eventually their heart writes the receipt. The room erupted into thoughtful applause before gradually falling quiet again. Caleb walked toward a display pedestal positioned beside the stage. Resting beneath a glass cover was the matte black card Mara had returned. Beside it lay the handwritten note. Most people see this card as a symbol of spending power, he said. I see it differently now. I see it as proof that character has no spending limit. He carefully lifted the glass cover before handing the card back to Mara. She looked surprised. I returned this because it was yours. Caleb smiled warmly. Not anymore. Confused murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. Caleb continued before speculation could grow louder. Miss Ellison, I am not giving this card back so you can continue shopping. I am offering you something much greater. Evelyn stepped onto the stage carrying a navy presentation folder embossed with the Whitmore Global Foundation seal. Caleb accepted it before placing it gently into Mara's hands. For years, our foundation has funded hundreds of worthy programs, but too often we make decisions from conference rooms instead of neighborhoods. I believe we have been missing something essential. We need someone who understands communities because she actually serves them. Someone who measures success in changed lives instead of headlines. Mara slowly opened the folder. Inside was an official employment offer, unanimously approved by the Whitmore Global Foundation Board, inviting her to become Director of Community Partnerships for the Whitmore Global Foundation, leading local initiatives across New York with complete organizational support and a budget dedicated to literacy, neighborhood health programs, shelters, and education. Her eyes widened as she quietly read each page. There must be someone more qualified, she whispered. Caleb gently shook his head. Qualifications can be taught. Compassion cannot. You have already shown me everything I needed to know. For the first time that evening, the applause filling the ballroom was not simply polite admiration. It was heartfelt respect from people who had just witnessed a rare moment when success was measured not by what someone owned, but by how many lives they quietly chose to lift. 1 year later, the same ballroom glowed beneath warm golden lights once again, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no mysterious challenges, no hidden tests, and no questions waiting to be answered. Instead, the evening celebrated the first anniversary of the Whitmore Global Foundation's Community Partnership Initiative, a program that had quietly expanded into neighborhoods across New York City. Literacy programs had doubled. Local shelters had received stable funding. Hospital assistance funds had eliminated thousands of dollars in unpaid prescription costs for struggling families. Independent bookstores had become community reading centers where children gathered every weekend to discover stories that encouraged them to dream beyond their circumstances. None of those accomplishments carried one person's name alone. They represented hundreds of volunteers, nonprofit organizations, teachers, nurses, business owners, and ordinary neighbors choosing kindness together. At the center of that growing network stood Mara Ellison, who still arrived at work carrying the same canvas bag she had owned before her life changed. She had accepted Caleb's offer only after insisting that every major decision include the voices of local communities rather than executives sitting behind conference tables. Caleb had agreed immediately. In truth, he found himself learning far more from Mara than she ever learned from him. She taught him that generosity worked best when people were invited into the conversation instead of being treated as projects. She reminded him that listening could be more powerful than speaking. She showed him that hope often began with small acts repeated faithfully rather than grand gestures performed once. During the past year, they had spent countless afternoons visiting schools, libraries, shelters, and neighborhood organizations together. Sometimes they traveled with foundation staff. Other times they arrived quietly without any announcement, carrying boxes of books or simply sitting down to hear people's stories. Somewhere between planning meetings, volunteer events, and long conversations over simple cups of coffee, friendship had slowly become something deeper. Neither of them rushed the journey. Trust grew naturally because it had been planted in honesty from the very beginning. That evening, After thanking every partner organization for their dedication, Caleb invited everyone toward the Foundation's new community gallery. Along one wall hung photographs capturing moments from the past year. Children opening their first books, volunteers serving warm meals, nurses smiling beside grateful patients, teachers surrounded by eager readers. Near the center of the gallery stood a small glass display. Inside rested the original matte black card beside Mara's handwritten note. Beneath them, a simple bronze plaque carried one sentence. Character is revealed not by what we can afford to keep, but by what we choose to give away. Guests paused quietly before the display, many reading the words more than once. Mara smiled softly when she noticed several young volunteers discussing the exhibit. One quietly remarked, "I thought the card was the treasure." Another answered, "Maybe the treasure was what it inspired." Caleb overheard the exchange and smiled to himself. As the evening slowly came to an end, he asked Mara if she would join him for a short walk onto the rooftop garden overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city shimmered beneath a blanket of stars while a gentle breeze carried the distant sounds of evening traffic. For several peaceful moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Caleb reached into his jacket pocket. Mara laughed softly. "Please tell me that is not another black card." Caleb laughed with her before shaking his head. No more tests. Instead, he revealed a small velvet box. Inside rested a simple platinum ring with a single diamond that reflected the city lights without overwhelming them. "The first time I trusted someone with unlimited resources," he said quietly. "I thought I was testing character. What I discovered instead was someone who helped me rediscover my own. You reminded me why my mother believed kindness was the greatest investment anyone could ever make. Mara Ellison, would you honor me by building the rest of that future together?" Tears filled Mara's eyes as she smiled through quiet emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "Not because you are a billionaire. Because you finally learned that people matter more than money." Caleb gently slipped the ring onto her finger as the city sparkled behind them. Months later, they celebrated a small wedding attended by family, close friends, volunteers, teachers, nurses, bookstore customers, and community partners whose lives had become intertwined through simple acts of generosity. There were no extravagant displays of wealth. Instead of expensive party favors, every guest received a beautifully designed bookmark carrying the same sentence Mara had written months earlier. Every story deserves someone who believes it can have a better ending. And for everyone whose life had been touched by one unexpected act of trust, those words had become more than a message. They had become a promise. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.